what I think's just taken place is a fairly clear defeat or very major setback for Hezbollah and Iran without being a clear victory for Israel. Without any question, the civilian grip of Hezbollah will be rebuilt south of the Litani now in the coming days and weeks, and I suspect that the current mechanisms, certainly not the Lebanese armed forces, which as you remember is supposed to be the main instrument for preventing it, are going to be fit for purpose.
So this week we have a ceasefire with Lebanon and Hezbollah, and we wanted to unpack it with you with Director of Research, Jonathan Spy for the Middle East Forum. Hi, Jonathan. How are you?
Hello, Fleur. Very well, thank you. How are you doing?
Good. I mean, in a way, confused. We don't know whether to be happy. We don't know whether to be suspicious. I myself think it must be a good thing because it's different this time than it was in 2006. But there's a lot of people that are very concerned that this is just the end of one more round. Could you unpack this for us and tell us, is it different than other times and how?
Yeah, so in my estimation, what I think's just taken place is a fairly clear defeat or very major setback for Hezbollah and Iran without being a clear victory for Israel. And let me explain what I mean by that. Hezbollah entered the war on October 8th with a very clear and stated goal. And the goal was stated in a number of statements by the movement, including on camera by then leader, Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. And what they said was various versions of the following. Hezbollah is entering the conflict in order to provide a support front for Hamas in Gaza. And this support front will be kept open for the duration of the war in Gaza. This was stated very clearly. This was the war aim of Hezbollah. This was the goal of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah have just abandoned that goal. And Hezbollah have abandoned that goal not as a result of their own free will, fairly obviously, but as a result of military pressure. That is what's called defeat or setback. You know, it's very clear. And if we look at the amount of damage which Hezbollah has suffered, and this is only now becoming apparent or beginning to become apparent, but there's a report from Reuters, including from their correspondent in Beirut this morning, in which an official of the movement is quoted as saying, or a source close to the movement is quoted as saying, Hezbollah may have suffered up to 4,000 dead in the course of the war, and up to something like $8.5 billion damage, I think was the sum quoted. Now, this is massive. It's vastly in excess of what Hezbollah suffered in the war of 2006, but also, very clearly, Hezbollah had war aims. It was induced to abandon those war aims. It therefore left the field of conflict. This is what is called defeat or setback, in the simplest terms. Why is this not, nevertheless, a victory for Israel, in my opinion? Because as a result of Hezbollah's willingness to leave the field, and therefore the agreement of a ceasefire, what has been reimposed is effectively the status quo ante bellum. It's not that Israel, as a result of the very telling blows imposed on Hezbollah and Hezbollah's consequent willingness to leave the fight, it's not that Israel has made any clear strategic or diplomatic gains. Rather, Resolution 1701 has been reimposed effectively. And this 1701, and we'll go on to discuss this, I guess, was a failure for reasons I guess we'll go into.
Well, Jonathan, yes, we've gone back to 1701. If they would only have respected that in the first place, we would never have had to have a war. But as you said, they had different aims. The question is it not victory, the fact that essentially we've now rendered officially UNIFIL out of the picture, useless, and we're bringing in the Americans as a supervising force, and B, that there's a snapback in the sense that we can go in at any time if we see that they're not complying?
First of all, I think we need to be accurate. I mean, UNIFIL is still there. What's disappeared is simply Israel's faith in UNIFIL, I suppose. If Israel had faith in UNIFIL, this was, I don't know. If Israel did, then it was severely misplaced. If Israel doesn't now, then education is a wonderful thing. But that doesn't mean UNIFIL has disappeared. UNIFIL is still one of the forces tasked with implementing Resolution 1701. Now, the other force, and this I think is probably the crucial element that I think people should be looking at. The other force, which is the main force that is tasked with implementing 1701, it's not Western forces. We'll go into the role of the West in a moment, but the force tasked on the ground with implementing 1701 is the Lebanese armed forces. That is to say, the army of the Lebanese state. So the success or failure of 1701 will be of the implementation of 1701 will be determined by the Lebanese armed forces. That was the case prior to this war. That was the case from 2006, and it's the case now. Which means if we want to determine whether anything has changed, or maybe more sharply, whether there is now a chance of preventing the rearming and rebuilding of Hezbollah south of the Litani, we need to be looking closely at the Lebanese armed forces. What is this instrument, and is it fit for purpose? The Lebanese armed forces, at least as far as I am aware, and I talk to many very knowledgeable people on this, is reckoned to consist of around 30 to 35% Shia soldiers. And the military intelligence of Lebanese armed forces, many informed sources will tell you, is basically very closely linked to Hezbollah. What this seems to me to indicate, and we can go into this, I guess, in further detail, is that the chances of the Lebanese armed forces effectively acting against Hezbollah to prevent its rebuilding and rearmament south of the Litani are, I think the nice phrase is vanishingly close to zero. That's the phrase I like to use.
Well, it seems that they've already been infiltrated by Hezbollah or Hezbollah ideology, from what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even just ideology. We're talking about familial links between Shia soldiers and Hezbollah. We're talking about the fact that, frankly, Hezbollah on the ground has been a much stronger force than Lebanese armed forces. Now it's now been severely weakened. But the question is whether the organizational cohesion and the political will be there in Lebanese armed forces in the LAF or LAF to act against Hezbollah. And because of these structural matters, I would say combined with the fact we shouldn't forget that the Iranian model for taking over Arab countries, it has a military element. But of course, it always also has a political element. Hezbollah is also a political party represented in the parliament and in the government. So the notion that there is kind of some Lebanese state force or Lebanese political body outside of Hezbollah which can act against Hezbollah is, in my view, just an unsophisticated and simplistic understanding of the situation in Lebanon. Hezbollah is deeply into the Lebanese state. Hezbollah is not only a kind of separate deep state, so to speak, next to the official state. It's also deeply inside the state, including the state armed forces. So the notion that these state armed forces are the kind of instrument you can set against Hezbollah is, in my estimation, just a misunderstanding of the basic realities of Lebanon.
And what about the government of Lebanon? Do you think this is their moment to gain some type of sovereignty away from Hezbollah? Or do you think they're too weak to do it?
It's not only that they're too weak to do it, it's that many elements within the government, certainly within the parliament, are aligned with Hezbollah itself. I mean, Hezbollah is a political player. And so when we talk about, for example, in recent days, the interlocutor who was being discussed from the Lebanese government is, of course, Speaker of the Parliament, Nabi Berri, who's head of Amal. But Amal is a movement that is aligned with Hezbollah. Let us not forget that in 2008, when the pro-Hezbollah forces wanted to demonstrate to the then pro-Western forces, what was then called the March 14th movement, who ran the show inside Beirut. If you remember, they took over West Beirut in the space of about 48 hours. They went through the security forces of the other side like a knife through butter. The people who did that was Amal people. Hezbollah people were just in the background. Hezbollah didn't even need to deploy its own forces. It deployed Amal. So once again, the very supposed representatives of the Lebanese state who the West or others are speaking to with the notion they'll act against Hezbollah are themselves often aligned with Hezbollah. So again, this is the crucial understanding to bear in mind.
So then why did Israel decide to go into a ceasefire when we essentially had them on the run?
Well, from what we're hearing, there was clearly an element of pressure from the United States administration. Again, we're hearing different versions of what exactly that may have consisted of from Prime Minister Netanyahu and from the US envoy Amos Hochstein in the course of the last 24 or 48 hours. And there's a dispute over, well, was there really threats with regard to weaponry? Was there really a threat with regard to U.S. actions in the United Nations Security Council? And we don't know, of course, who's exactly right or wrong in this, but I think it's pretty clear that, there was an element of Israel needing to consider the American perspective here. I think from 2 points of view, not only to sort of blame the administration. First of all, the administration fairly clearly wanted to wrap this up. But certainly from what I've been reading, there's a sense in Israel that the president-elect, Donald Trump, also wanted this to be wrapped up by the time he comes into office. And Hochstein had made very clear, whether he was doing brinkmanship or telling the truth is neither here nor there, but he'd made it very clear this was the last attempt that the US administration was going to make to reach a deal on this. If it didn't work now, then okay, the administration was going to say, no problem, it can wait for the next administration. I think Israel didn't want that. It was clear that Trump would like this to have been solved to have been, in place, a ceasefire in place, prior to his coming into office. So I think the American issue was very, very important here. I think there's other issues as well. There is a sense, which I think everybody close to Israeli military circles is aware, that the army is very tired. The army has been in active fighting now for over a year in both Gaza and then, of course, since September or early October, rather, in Lebanon, in quite an intense way. The army is in need of a rest. The reservists are in need of a rest. There is a need for replenishment of ammunition and supplies. And for that reason, I think there was also a desire to give, to give people a rest. And I think that was another issue. So these 2 points of view issues would seem to me to be the main ones. Possibly also there is a sense that there wasn't a great deal more to be gained because apparently, in my opinion, regrettably, but apparently the notion of a demilitarized or buffer zone north of the border had been abandoned, I guess because the Americans were set against it. And so if you're not going to try and create a buffer zone, you're not going to actually try and change the basic facts on the grounds north of the border, then all you're going to be carrying on doing is just killing more and more Hezbollah people, which from a certain point of view is good, of course. But if then there's a counter pressure from the Americans regarding the timeline of the incoming new president, or the soon-to-be incumbent new president, then I guess the calculation was done. Okay, then it's time now to settle the matter, at least for now.
Jonathan, do you think also here, and maybe that's just wishful thinking for us, there's a quid pro quo about letting us deal with Iran? Or that's what Prime Minister Netanyahu hinted. It's like, we need to do this because we're dealing with the head of the snake, and somehow the Americans are now not objecting, or that's part of the deal, that they won't object to a much harsher strike that could topple the Iranian regime.
I very much hope so. I'm not quite clear on why there's a contradiction between the two. Otherwise, I don't quite get the point that, it's okay, we can leave the Hezbollah issue in limbo now and not have an achievement because we're about to take care of the big guys. That sounds a little bit to me like kind of, how can I put it? A sort of speculative future achievement in return for not having a concrete achievement in the here and now. That tends to make me a bit suspicious, so to speak. But the talk is cheap, especially from politicians, with all due respect to our elected leaders. Having said that, I am very optimistic, or very hopeful is perhaps a better way of putting it, regarding the US administration about to take office in terms of the Iranian issue. I think that there are, if we look at the people who are coming in to be the senior officials of the new administration, among them there are many individuals who have a very clear understanding of the threat posed by Iran and of the fundamental and cardinal need for the regime in Tehran to cease to exist if there is to be a chance for real positive developments across the Middle East in the period ahead. There are many, many people in the top ranks of the incoming administration who really get that. And of course, there are people around Netanyahu, including he himself, hopefully, who get it as well. So yeah, there's an immense, how can I put this? There's a lot of energy right now for the building of a new and potentially a radical break with the cautious policies in the past in order to make it a strategic objective for the bringing down of Islamic Republic of Iran. Not Israel can't do it by itself, but Israel with America can push towards that. We shouldn't get too hopeful because we know we should be ready for disappointment always, yeah? But there's more of a chance of such a strategy now, in my estimation, than at any time in the past.
I totally agree with you. And maybe this is why I'm thinking that it might not just have been the Biden administration or Amos Hochstein who said now or never. It may have been Trump as well, who Bibi has had so many conversations with, who said, listen, wrap up Lebanon and I'll give you carte blanche in Iran. We'll even help you out.
Well, that would be nice. I mean, we should always hope for good things. And that's certainly what Prime Minister Netanyahu hinted at in his speech. Having said that, one should learn to be skeptical, I think, of the speeches of prime ministers. Netanyahu is aware, and this is an interesting development, I think. Netanyahu is aware in this case that he's acting against the desires and interests, or the desires and preferences of his base.
Absolutely.
At this point. So arguably it could be the sort of throwing a kind of potential future commitment of like, well, yeah, this looks like weakness now, or not weakness, but this looks like settling for something less than the best right now. But that's okay, because it's all about sort of banking credit for the future. And so, yeah, maybe we're going to find out, aren't we? That's the point in the months ahead.
Absolutely. And how hopeful are you that they're actually going to stick to this, or how quickly could Hezbollah rearm?
Well, you mentioned earlier the heightened or greater role of the United States in the new arrangements now coming in, and that takes two forms. One is in terms of the enforcement committee, or the enforcement mechanism rather, which will be led by the Americans, and which will include also the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. And this is a new and strengthened mechanism that didn't exist before. And the second thing is the letter of guarantee, so to speak, which America offered separately to Israel as part of the agreement of this ceasefire, like outside of international bodies. And what will all this mean in practice? I think the biggest difference, which it seems to imply, is that Israel now has the potential for extending what used to be called the war between the wars. You remember that? In Syria, now to Lebanon also. In the past, when Israel conducted the war between the wars, it conducted it only in Syria. And it appears there is now a chance for the same Syria rules to be applied to the weakened Hezbollah south of the Litani in Lebanon. Will that make, in my estimation, a cardinal difference to Hezbollah's ability to rearm? Sadly, I think it probably won't. After all, let us remember, the war between the wars, and let us be clear on this, was a failure. It was a failure.
Explain to us a little bit what that means.
I'm sorry, yeah. The war between the wars, or campaign between the wars, the Mabam in Hebrew, was the campaign conducted by Israel in the years preceding the current war, in which Israel carried out, if you remember, weekly or sometimes nightly bombings in Syria of efforts by Iran to supply Hezbollah with weaponry. And what we've now found out from October 8th, 2023, is that for all the efforts expended, Hezbollah was very well armed, including with the weapon systems that we'd been told we were trying to prevent. Otherwise, the war between the wars, and let's not put too fine a point on it, was a failure. It blew up lots of stuff. It killed lots of bad people, which is, of course, good. But it didn't stop Hezbollah and Iran from getting to where they wanted to be on October 8th, 2020.
Yeah.
We've now, of course, set back that capacity enormously. But obviously, there's now a ceasefire. So we're into a new reality, something resembling the war between the wars. Is this likely to work differently because it may now be applied in Lebanon as well as in Syria? I'm not convinced. And I think if you look at the wording so far, we're aware of at least of the letter and of the task of the new enforcement mechanism. What it seems to be saying is that Israel, if it perceives an immediate danger, can act immediately to neutralize it. But anything more than that, it needs to go through the enforcement mechanism in order to act. But of course, the danger is not going to be an immediate danger. Rearmament, by its very nature, is not an immediate danger. It's a danger set for the future. So it would seem to me that there's a considerable likelihood that Israel will not find itself having freedom to act in carte blanche south of the Litani. It'll need to go through the preferences of the Americans and the French and the Germans and the British. And I would suspect, given the different interests of those states, that will not result in the kind of intensity of action necessary to prevent Hezbollah's rearmament. What I can say, even from my own experience, and I visited South Lebanon in 2007, a year after the war of 2006. I mean, I was there during the war as well as a soldier, but I was there as a journalist in 2007. And then, accompanied by knowledgeable Lebanese friends who were with me, we could already see the telltale signs that Hezbollah had reimposed its civilian grip south of the Litani. And that's the nature of how it begins. First of all, they reimpose their unquestioned authority south of the Litani, and then they begin to build that up in terms of military hardware. Without any question, the civilian grip of Hezbollah will be rebuilt south of the Litani now in the coming days and weeks. And I suspect, I know that then the effort at rearmament and rebuilding will begin. And I suspect that the current mechanisms, certainly not the Lebanese armed forces, which, as you remember, is supposed to be the main instrument for preventing it, are going to be fit for purpose. So it's going to take them a very long time because they have suffered very, very severe and serious damage. But is there a serious barrier to their eventual rebuilding and rearmament, whether it's the mechanism or the letter from the Americans or the Lebanese armed forces or UNIFIL? My opinion is none of those will prove fit for purpose.
Jonathan, what's the American letter? Explain it to us, unpack it for us. What is in there that we didn't have before?
Before there wasn't any. Before, Israel was entirely dependent on Resolution 1701 and the bodies established thereof in terms of its arrangements north of the border. That is to say, 1701 itself, and then UNIFIL and the LAF. And what the letter does is it's kind of a separate commitment from America to Israel, essentially saying that, America understands Israel's needs in this regard, and America supports Israel's right to prevent Hezbollah's rearmament. It's a general commitment of understanding regarding Israel's needs in this area, and it's new. Nothing like that existed before.
I mean, it feels like an extra layer of help from America above and beyond the committee. So it's saying, even if this committee thing doesn't work with the other countries, from us, you've got the carte blanche to do what you need to do.
Yeah, that's all. I mean, I wouldn't say it's carte blanche. Carte blanche implies that you can do anything you want, right? No, I don't think it's that. And it's not even that in terms of its wording. And it certainly won't be that in terms of practicalities. It's an extra layer. It's a new, and it's a strange kind of thing. It's a letter. So what standing do letters have in international diplomacy? Or it's not clear. It's just somebody. It's a letter. That's a nice thing. Can you take it to the bank? Can you say, yeah, but you wrote me a letter 2 years ago, so surely why? I wouldn't count that. So it's something nice. It's better that it's there than that it should not be there. But do we think this is going to be sufficient? As I say, I should be very clear on my own view here. My view is the following: that there is nothing other than either a buffer zone or a continuation of the war, i.e. of daily bombings of any Hezbollah attempts to rebuild south of the Litani, which will be sufficient given that organization's continued political dominance and given Iranian continued support for it, and given Bashar Assad of Syria's continued willingness for his territory to be used for the transfer of weaponry. Nothing other than that will in fact be sufficient to stop Hezbollah's rearmament. Ergo, Hezbollah is going to rearm. It's going to take them a very long time because they've suffered a very severe blow, but I'm simply not convinced by any of these mechanisms. I think many others in Israel also tacitly are also not. They understand for other reasons which we discussed that maybe the need for this now, arguably, but I think very few people within Israel, the body of people in Israel who look at this stuff in a serious way, think that Hezbollah is not going to rearm and rebuild itself south of the Litani. It kind of clearly is.
Yeah, the question is that if we're confident that within a year, for example, America will let us have free hand in bankrupting the Islamic Republic or bombing its main sources of income, its oil fields, etc. If in our own minds we're saying, you know what, let's give them this because we'll deal with that. And once we've dealt with the Islamic Republic, Hezbollah falls anyway.
Yeah,
think there's anything in that?
Yeah, sure. That's good, but I'm going to put it. Isn't there a saying in English something like a bird in the hand is worth three in the bush. In other words, meaning that, it's an actual concrete achievement is better than a much superior notional or dreamed of achievement in the future. Yeah, bringing down the Islamic Republic would, of course, be great, but it's a massive historic undertaking to bring down the Islamic Republic of Iran. Yes, I hope very much that, given the soon-to-be incumbent U.S. administration, the stage will be set for a strategic push to bring down Islamic Republic of Iran. But this is a massive, massive historic order. That might happen, and it might very seriously not happen. There's all sorts of reasons why it might not happen too. Right now, the concrete business of the day is Hezbollah, an arrangement for Israel's residents of the northern border area. From their point of view, as I think we've seen in recent days, this agreement leaves a great deal to be desired. Again, like I said, Hezbollah has suffered a defeat. I mean, the attempts by their partisans in their media over the last 48 hours to try, of course, naturally, inevitably, victory are scarcely short of hilarious. It's simply ludicrous to know.
You see them going around with a V sign surrounded by rubble. It's kind of funny.
It's really ridiculous. But that doesn't, I think, detract from the very serious questions regarding the likely future direction of events north of the border.
Jonathan, you mentioned about the northern residents and specifically the northern mayors who are not exactly happy with this deal because they don't quite trust it. Do you see the 70,000 displaced people going back to their homes immediately?
First of all, we should remember that there is written into this ceasefire agreement a 60-day period, a sort of pilot period in which Israel cooperates with LAF in terms of dismantling of Hezbollah infrastructure and so on. So from what I'm aware of, Israel is not even currently calling for residents to immediately come back to their homes. People will wait, and there'll be a kind of staggered period in which people will gradually be invited to come back. Will people come back or not? My sense is that if we're talking about a period of now over the next half year or so to speak, which is what I've heard being talked about, I think a great many of those people will come back. Speaking to residents of the North, the fact is that there's a certain number of just practicalities here. If people have mortgages on houses that, of course, right now they can't sell because nobody's going to buy a house in Metula or Kiryat Shmona for obvious reasons, then, they kind of almost don't have a great deal of choice. That the logic of their lives will lead them back to those homes and so on. I wouldn't be surprised, we shall see, if we may see a certain thinning out of the population a little bit, for obvious reasons. But I think by and large, once the guns stop firing, dissatisfied as the mayors and residents clearly are regarding some of the terms of the ceasefire, I think over the next few months, we will begin to see the bulk of that population returning to their homes.
I think I feel a little more depressed after this conversation, Jonathan, but I completely agree with you about what will happen with Hezbollah. They can't be trusted. The guarantees in place do not seem enough or sufficient. And so maybe we are left with the fact that Israeli soldiers actually need a breath after fighting in two fronts, and perhaps even America slow rolling the defense help that they've done, which has actually affected us. And this is the end of that slow rolling of the equipment we actually need to finish the war with Gaza. And I just want to ask you one more question. How linked do you think this is to the conflict in Gaza? Or is the achievement for Israel the unlinking of it?
First of all, the achievement of Israel, the unlinking of it, as you put it, is a very significant achievement indeed. And I think that we need to, it's worth restating that the whole war aim of Hezbollah, the whole reason for Hezbollah entering the fight was that linkage. Israel succeeded through military pressure in unlinking it. And Israel, Hezbollah did Israel a huge favor from a certain point of view by entering the fight on that basis. As a result of that, Israel has killed Hezbollah's historic strategic leader, Hassan Nasrallah, who takes the movement to undreamt of heights in terms of both political domination inside Lebanon and in terms of capacity against Israel. He has gone now and the movement is flailing and headless at the present time. And we will see if they manage to pull themselves together, but it's going to take them a long time. So in this sense, absolutely, this was a very significant achievement to unlink from Gaza. Secondly, just lastly, with regard to the issue of Israeli troops and needing a break, I think not everybody who's close to the structures of Israel's fighting units is quite aware sometimes of what that means. I mean, I don't do reserve duty anymore, but I'm superannuated, sadly. But I recently went to a reunion of the unit in which I served in the reserves for 17 years. And I spoke to some of the guys who are currently serving, because the unit's currently in Gaza. And I said to them, how much have you been serving over the course of the last year, since October of 2023? And they said, by the time October 2024 comes around, this was a few months ago, we've done 8 months in the reserves.
Which is crazy.
Which is just something unheard of. So yes, people are exhausted, including the most committed populations. And it's not surprising and entirely understandable that people are desirous now of a little bit of a timeout.
So let's pray that with this new deal, maybe it leaves us open to making a deal. It seems that Hamas announced yesterday, inspired by this, that they're interested in a ceasefire. Do you think that that's on the books right now?
I mean, it's clear that they are under greater pressure now as a result of Hezbollah leaving the line, so to speak. I think in a way, this ceasefire agreement puts the final nail in the coffin of the late Yahya Sinwar's hope that his initiated massacre on October 7th, 2023 would lead to an all-out military effort by the Iran-led regional alliance against Israel. That very clearly is not going to happen now. With regard to possible deal in Gaza, just to say that, I think it does increase the possibility of that, but there remains a basic and cardinal point, which is that up until now, at least, Hamas has been determined that in return for any ceasefire, any deal on Gaza, Israel has to withdraw entirely from the Gaza Strip, meaning that Hamas will then intend to rebuild its governance in the area. For as long as they stick to that demand, it seems to me that any deal is quite unlikely with the current Israeli government. If they now prove willing to come down from that demand, then yes, I think that a great deal is now maybe on the table. So we'll see.
Well, it's very interesting, I think, in the lead up to January 20th, when Trump assumes office, whether things will be sorted by then. As I heard a rumor, he said to Bibi, finish it up by the time I get there, or whether actually once we get to January 20th, if things are not resolved, then we'll resolve at a faster pace because, that Gaza, Hamas understand that there's not going to be any holding back in terms of America demands on Israel. And maybe that in itself is incentive enough for them to decide to make a deal with us.
Yeah, I hope so. Like I said, I think that, they are certainly under greater pressure now and a lot more alone now as a result of the current ceasefire deal, which is certainly a net positive. And it will remain to be seen if they're willing to make that, from their point of view, quite major leap towards accepting that, okay, we effectively have to surrender, which is what they're agreeing to a continued Israeli presence in Gaza would mean. Up until now, they've proven reluctant to do that. Yeah, we'll see if that, as you say, the additional sort of new ingredient of a new U.S. administration may be prepared to let Israel, go in harder and further, induce them to do so. We're going to find out pretty soon.
We'll find out pretty soon. And Jonathan, we're very grateful for your analysis. It's always on point. And we pray that peace lasts and prevails. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Fleur.